I'm Janet Jacobson, and I'm the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and I want to welcome you to, or welcome you back to, the For the Public Good Conference and to our keynote lecture. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a few thank yous. First of all, as always, the Barnard Center for Research on Women is one of the co-sponsors for this and has done a lot of the logistical work, and so I want to thank Ann Jonas and Pamela Phillips for everything that they did in order to make this conference happen. And I also want to thank all of the faculty who were involved in the For the Public Good project over the past several years. And in particular, we owe a special thanks to the project's initiator, our good colleague in the education program, who is going to retire, which is wrong. I'm an ethicist. That's a moral claim. She's been a great colleague. She's been a great ally to BCRW. She's built the education program and kept it committed to public education and to public life in general in ways that are really, really important. We are forever indebted, not just for this project, but for everything she's done here to Lee Bell. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Ta-Nehisi Coates. His official biography, which he sent to us, is very short, which I will now read his accomplishments, and then I will actually say some more things, so that's great that he made it so short, so I can talk a lot. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a national correspondent for The Atlantic and the Martin Luther King Visiting Scholar at MIT. In 2012, Coates won a National Magazine Award for his essay, Fear of a Black President, and he is the author of the debut memoir, The Beautiful Struggle. And I really recommend that you read the memoir. It's a beautiful book. I live with an English professor. She thinks it's a beautiful book, and you know, they don't like anything, so that tells you something. And it's also a very powerful book, so if you haven't had a chance to read it, I recommend that you do. And BCRW is particularly happy to have Ta-Nehisi join us around the For the Public Good concept, because one of the interventions he's made, in addition to his writing and the content of his writing, is about creating public space for discussion through the web and in creating a community for that. At BCRW, as you know, we do a lot on the web, and we think a lot about the norms of interaction in this space. And one of the things about the community that Ta-Nehisi engages with is that it's a powerful public community in which discussion is respectful. It's often there's often disagreement, but it's carried forward in a way that is extremely illuminating, and that comes from the way in which he engages his public. So we're very glad to have him here in talking about masculinities and violence, and to join us in thinking about the public good. Ta-Nehisi Coates.
I have water here and I have coffee. You don't need anything else in life. Maybe wine, right? Maybe wine. That's about it. Okay. You got to make sure you don't knock anything over. So when I was a kid, I have a bunch of brothers and sisters, and my dad used to cook a lot. And, he would have, all the kids there. And without fail, I would, knock something over. And this has, been the joke that has dogged me. I'm 38 years old now, 38, I'm losing count, 38 years old. And whenever we get together, I am reminded that I'm that kid. No one ever lets me forget that. It's such a pleasure to be here, if I can get this unhooked. And it's always a pleasure to be asked, to speak before a college, which, curiously enough, happens a lot lately. And I say curious because my relationship to college and my relationship to, how shall we say, mainstream education was troubled. I was a curious kid. I loved to read. I'd read whatever, if I was curious about something, I'd, read whatever I get my hands on. And would just burn through books at a pretty heroic pace. My problem was that I was only curious about what I wanted to be curious about. So, if it was something going on in school and I was actually curious about it, I was dead curious about it. If it wasn't, then I could care less. And that didn't make for a very good student or for a very good scholastic record. But I was always thought of as pretty intelligent. I got into a magnet high school in Baltimore, and I got kicked out of that high school for grades in my sophomore year. My parents came back up to the school. I had very active parents. Came back up to the school, argued me back in. And I got kicked out again. And that just, I think I failed 4 out of 7 classes. It was something really, really ridiculous. I'm going away this summer to study language at Middlebury for like 7 weeks, and I had to, in order to get in, I had to pull my college transcript. It's an absolute nightmare. I mean, it was hideous. I was writing them. I was saying, is there any way I can get around this transcript part? There was no way. It was very sad. But I say that to say that, in that time, as a young person in high school, as a young person in college, I had no notion that I would ever, be talking before a group of people who were certainly in education much more accomplished than I ever was, and probably ever would be. When I was in school, there was a constant fear. I grew up in the mid to late 80s, early 90s in West Baltimore at a time where the crime rates for young black boys, the murder rates for young black boys and young black men were really, really off the charts. People think it's bad now, but it was really, really bad back then. And there was a strong thought that the thing that stood between you, if you were a young black boy, and the corner, the thing that stood between you and death, the thing that stood between you and jail, the thing that stood between you and drugs was education. And that was, pretty much the mantra in my household. And so for me to not do well in school was not like a cute thing. It wasn't, okay, one day he'll get it together. It was an existential crisis. You're putting your life in danger. That was the feeling. If you don't get this right, then I don't know what's going to happen to you. And I think like that's the situation for a lot of young black boys even today. And perhaps for a lot of, maybe I should expand that out and say for a lot of young black people, and maybe even increasingly for all Americans in the country at large. But certainly that was a big fear in my childhood. So as I did terribly, just performed terribly, went to college and just performed terribly. I went to Howard University in DC, and I think I spent more time in the library than I did in class. Again, just curious about what I was curious about. But as I did terribly, it was, there was no sense that like I was gonna, drop out of school and like found Facebook or Microsoft, right? That's what you do when you drop out of Harvard. You drop out of Howard, you're putting yourself in some danger. If anything, it was that line between me and that dark place, that oblivion that, so many of my friends that I had grown up with, tumbled into. That was what, I greatly feared awaited me, and that was what my parents greatly feared awaited me. I left Howard almost 20 years ago. And I think, like, one of the cool things about not tumbling into that oblivion, one of the big things that I think people miss when we talk about the fate of young black boys, and when we talk about, when we look at, like, lifespans, and we look at African Americans, we see African Americans, live, less time than other people in this country. One of the things that's missed is the right to change, the right to evolve, the right to become a different person. So who I am standing up in front of you is not who I was at 20 years old. Part of that change came this summer. I got to pursue my language study in France. Is Kathleen, are you here anywhere? Oh, there's Kathleen. There's my old French tutor right there. Who's if anybody wants to learn French, there's an excellent tutor for you right there. But I went over, I got the opportunity to be in France this summer. And I took French in 7th grade. And I was who I was. I was a horrible student. I had not only was I bad at French, I had no understanding of why anyone would study French. There were no French people in West Baltimore that I knew. France was some clump of earth across an ocean somewhere. I was never going there. Why would anyone learn French? For what? And all people could tell you was so you don't go to jail, right? Like that was the answer to everything. Get an education or go to jail. I mean, that was the basic. And, they aren't wrong. I mean, the people are afraid for their kids. That's what they're telling them. And it's very similar to the message we give today. But that has nothing to do with intellectual curiosity. That has nothing to do with, exploration. That has nothing to do with the rest of the world. I got over there, and I was with my family. And I had gone over there once before during that same year. I was 37 years old. It was the first time in my life I had gotten an adult passport. It was deeply shameful. It's shameful even as I say this to you right now. But it's, it shows you the kind of limits that we have when we grow up in certain ways. Anyway, I was there, and I was walking along the center. It was very, very nice with a friend, whose apartment we ultimately ended up doing an exchange with. And I was watching the kids. And it was late. It was like 11 o'clock at night. And there were all these kids like down in the lower level of sin, doing what kids do, making out, doing whatever. And early in the day, I'd seen all these kids like kicking like the soccer ball up and down the street, and people just really, really just hanging out, in a way that in America we call trespassing. But they just do it. It's just what they do, and this was like fascinating to me. And I thought, had somebody told me at 13 that if you learn French, you may see that people live in a different way. You may see a world that's so far away from what you see here in West Baltimore that it would just blow your mind. You may see a totally different way of being. I can't guarantee you I would have, but I might have been a little bit different about my language study and my thoughts about language. I would not be at 38 trying to master the language now. When I was in France this summer, the verdict came out for Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman's killer. It came out that he had been found not innocent on all charges. And this is just a really interesting time because my son was over there with me, and we had made a decision to leave him at a French immersion camp for 6 weeks. And this was like something that we could not, like when we were kids, we didn't even know that existed. And the idea that people leave their 12 or 13-year-old kids somewhere, with people who you've never met until that day, who you've given a lot of money to, is bizarre. But my son, he was living in a different world, and he was seeing a different world, and I was, myself seeing a different world, and I was changing, and I was becoming different. Like in that moment, I could feel it. My consciousness was changing. I was seeing people act in different ways. The smallest thing, for instance, you would walk down the street, and you would see people, instead of facing each other, they would face the street, and they would watch you, and you would watch them. And that was a different way of being, and I was seeing that. And at the same time, I got this news that this man who had killed this boy, that the country effectively said that his life was worth nothing. That there was nothing the justice system could do about that. And I kept thinking about Trayvon Martin. And I kept thinking about how it would have been for me to die at 17, to be frozen in that moment, to never be given the opportunity to change and become something different. I knew nothing at 17. And so when we talk about lifespans, and when we talk about, we put these numbers out, what the murder rate is, for, X group, or we see these stats about African-American life that we've all gotten a little too used to. And what we don't see is the robbery of the right to evolve, to bear witness to this wonderful planet. You actually lose more time to bear witness to everything that's going on. And I just kept thinking about myself at 17 and what I would have lost. I would go on my Facebook page when the verdict came out. And again, having that distance, not really, seeing the news and watching it every day, it was like a broad national mourning was happening in virtual reality. My family, my friends, African Americans and otherwise, how could this happen? What happened here? What went wrong? What can we do? Just, a great, great amount of despair. And at that point, I don't, think, this was so much about being in France, but just having, thought and, done, my share of research on the force of racism and the force of white supremacy in this country, my question back was, how could it not happen? When we talk about losing the chance to bear witness, when we talk about these horrible statistics, there's a tendency to view them in isolation, as though this sort of, came out of nowhere. So, you get into the courtroom and you say, well, how could the jury rule this way? But there's a game that happens way before that. The way I always talk about it, I equate it with like, any football fans in here? Okay, I didn't think of it. Oh, we got a few, that's okay, we have a few. Don't worry, I'm less and less a football fan every day. I'm gonna risk it and make a football, metaphor here. But, in fact, like you look at, the case with Trayvon Martin, or you look at the one that's, really been bugging me lately with Jordan Davis, and what folks are doing is we are on the last play in the fourth quarter, and we're wondering how we lost the game, and we're pinning it on that one play. But there are a series of plays that happened way before that jury even got into the courtroom. One of the things that needs to be understood when we talk about losing this right to change, when we talk about losing this right to bear witness, is that the robbery of that right, taking that away from African Americans, is foundational. A way to consider this is there's a deep belief in this country that people have the right to take things from black people, that people have the right to take black property, that people have the right to take black children, that people have the right to take black life. And if you think about the history of this country, it will immediately make sense to you why that's true. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to bore you with a history lesson here. It shouldn't bore you. I hope it doesn't bore you. I hope this doesn't bore you too much. There are things that we know about ourselves, but we don't reflect on enough, okay? Like the fact that slavery is foundational to America, right? Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that, when this country was founded, that if you look at the colonial history of this country, whether, we're standing here in New Amsterdam, whether we're looking at Florida under the Spanish, whether we're looking at Virginia under the English, wherever you're going to look, shortly after the history of early proto-Americans arriving, citizens of the United States, you see black people enslaved arriving, okay? So if you take Virginia, just founded somewhere around 1607, I think the official date for the Virginia colony is 1607, maybe Jamestown is like 1607. Within 10 or 12 years, you have African Americans enslaved in Virginia. And the existence of these people, them being brought to Virginia in this sort of way, is not incidental to Virginian history, and it's not incidental to American history. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the original labor source in a colony like Virginia would have been indentured servitude. If you're white, you're in England, you want to go somewhere that's better, you sign, basically you sign your life away for 7 years. You go, you do your service, and then you get out. And that's the end of it. If you look at early history of how they treated these people, it's hauntingly similar to what slavery was. So you would see like indentured service being beat, for instance. You see torture, for instance. You would see people taking contracts and attempting to lengthen out the contracts to get people to serve longer. You would see rich planners trading the contracts of their workers in card games or in gambling. Very, very similar to what would come after. But this left the Virginia colony with a basic problem. You work for me for 7 years, and then I turn you loose into the Virginia countryside. You go take out a piece of land, and you become a farmer too. Well, now you're competing with me. And I keep bringing in people in this labor system who compete with me. And also people who have, ostensibly rights. These are people who are English citizens. But we create a basic problem because, we have people coming in, and these people end up, competing with you, and these are people with actual rights. Even when they're servants, they're still citizens of the crown. They still have claims as, English people, citizens of the queen. They still can appeal to being, part of something larger. African slaves can't do that. African slaves are outside of society, presumably captured in war, brought to Virginia colony, and pretty much available to be worked as hard as you want to work them. In the early history of slavery in Virginia, you see occurring what happens whenever two populations of people get together who are not familiar with each other. You see people getting together, marrying, having sex, having children. We talk about like this whole idea of biracial, like it's a new thing, like it just happened. And what few people realize is, biraciality is the foundation of African American identity. It's foundational to us. But that's another topic. We'll get back to that in a minute. So you had this group of people who are outside of society. And you had the ability to work them as hard as you want to work them and keep them, enslaved, bonded for life, as long as you want to keep them enslaved. And you can see how that, offers a workforce that can be exploited in a way that servants cannot. If you look at the legal history of early Virginia colony and really the slave codes across the country, what you see over the course of history is rights being taken away, what little rights slaves had, being taken away, and rights being awarded to poor whites, people who were indentured servants at one point in time or were the descendants of indentured servants. So, some of this looks small, but it'll be things like, for instance, if a black person strikes a white person, that person is automatically subject to certain penalties. That, would not be the case if it were the reverse. It's things like if a black person runs away with a white person, say it's an indentured servant, I'm a slave, we run away together, the indentured servant has to serve out an extra 7 years with the black person or whatever time they ran away. Penalizing any sort of unity between the two groups. And cleaving them away and making it very clear that to be black is a particular class of thing in America. One of the worst laws comes in the early 18th century, actually. And there's an area of Virginia where they pass a law where they basically say any property that slaves have owned been given to them by, from time to time a master might give you a mule or, a plot or, of land to grow something on. This was basically seized and given to the parishes to sell off for the benefit of poor whites that lived in Virginia. I should make a citation here just so you know I'm not talking off my head. It's a great book by the historian Edmund Morgan, American Slavery, American Freedom. Excellent, excellent book that I'm speaking from right now. So what you see is this cleaving apart. And so black people don't just become people, who are oppressed, but a separate group of people. And this separation is foundational. John C. Calhoun, who is considered one of America's great statesmen, was a senator for South Carolina. He articulated it best when he talked about the slave society in America. He said, with us, the two great divisions of society are not rich and poor, but white and black. And all the form of the poor as well as the rich belong to the upper class and are respected and treated as equals. This is blackness becoming class itself. That the mark on your skin becomes where you are located in society. That's a social condition. But there's an economic aspect of this that makes this foundational to America. If you were, say, in 1860, you were an alien, or you were from Europe, and you wanted to, you came to America, and you said, take me to where the wealthiest people in this country live. You would end up in Natchez, I believe. I think it's Natchez, Mississippi. Because Natchez, Mississippi had per capita more multimillionaires than anywhere in the country. And anybody want to guess why Natchez, Mississippi had more multimillionaires than anywhere in the country? Natchez, Mississippi was the slave trading hub. So this is built on the trading of human beings. And the thing you have to understand is, again, slave trading is one of these words that's like really, really abstract. When we talk about slave trading, what I mean is the right to take your son, your daughter, your husband, your wife, put them on an auction block and send them somewhere where you will not see them for the rest of your natural life. This is borderline murder as far as I'm concerned. I mean, there's no telecommunications in the 19th century. So if I take your husband and I say, you're not going to see him again. It's a death sentence in terms of any sort of communication that you have. And this was foundational to what America was. If you were to come to visit this country in 1860 on the onset of the Civil War, 60% of American exports were derived from cotton picked by slaves, obviously. If you were to go to South Carolina and you wanted to take a census and get an idea of who was living in South Carolina at the onset of the Civil War, the majority of people there would be enslaved. If you want to go to Mississippi and do the same thing, the majority of people there would be enslaved. If you were going to Alabama or Georgia or Louisiana, somewhere around 50% of the people living there were enslaved. 1/3 of all people living in the South at the beginning of the Civil War were slaves. So when you talk about like slavery, it's not, Americans have this sort of notion that, slavery was this kind of side thing. Like it was America, and then, we kind of did this thing over here, and that was too bad. We got this secret over here that we did. But no, there's no America without it. If I take away 60% of your exports, you're not a country anymore. You're something totally different. If I take away 1/3 of the people, living in among you, you're obviously foundationally very, very different. So slavery is a foundational thing, and then it's worth thinking about how this affected African Americans themselves. A slave living in antebellum America had a 30% chance of being sold. 50%, I believe, 50% of these sales destroyed a family or a nuclear marriage. When you hear people talk today, and it's constant, about the black family, the destruction of black family, black people don't care about family, understand that the destruction of black families is foundational to America. I'm not being rhetorical about that. When you start talking about cotton profits and that's literally what slave trading is. It's the destruction of families. It must be. And why I think it's important to hold all of these notes in your head, it's also worth remembering that these were human beings and worth remembering how they felt about this. Henry Box Brown was a slave in Richmond, Virginia. He became famous because he escaped on the Underground Railroad by having himself put in a box and then shipped up north. One of my favorite stories about Henry Box Brown is Frederick Douglass hated his guts because after Box Brown escaped, he had this drawing made up of his escape, and he went around touring, giving lectures and giving this theatrical presentation of how he escaped, which then made it tough for everybody else who wanted to escape. So they were like beefing back and forth. It's sort of funny, like you think about the Underground Railroad and these guys like having a public fight. Which they did. Frederick Douglass called the Underground Railroad. He said Box Brown made it the Overground Railroad because he kept talking about it. But it's worth thinking about what would make a man, stuff himself in a box, and be shipped to Pennsylvania. If you're living in Richmond, Virginia, in the 1840s, to be shipped in a box to Pennsylvania, I mean, it's not like today. You don't get on an Amtrak. It's not a flight, with a quick layover or something like that. This is weeks. And what compelled Box Brown was the destruction of his family. When, at a certain point, his wife was owned by somebody different than him. And the owner decided they wanted to sell his wife. And Box Brown was very well regarded among white people in Richmond. And he thought that if he talked to enough people, he could get somebody to buy his wife and to buy his kids, both of whom were going to be lost to him. That was one way that black people worked to preserve their families. They would find somebody else to buy and keep the family together. Box Brown told his wife on the day that the sale was supposed to go through and they were supposed to leave, listen, I'm going to try to get this done. If I don't, I will come see you. I will come see you one last time. And he told his kid the same thing. And Box Brown went and he, tried to talk to all the white people he knew, find somebody to buy his wife and buy his kids. He was unsuccessful. He went to meet his wife. And his wife was in one of these coffles where they, chain black people and they, walk them out, after they've been sold or to be sold. And he talks about what that was like. And he says, the next day I stationed myself by the side of the road, along which the slaves amounting to 350 were to pass. The purchaser of my wife was a Methodist minister who was about starting for North Carolina. Pretty soon, 5 wagon loads of little children passed, and looking at the foremost one, what should I see but a little child, pointing its tiny hand towards me, exclaiming, there's my father. I knew he would come and bid me goodbye. Of course, Box Brown never saw his family again. That was just the end. That was just the end. This was common. I mean, in the run-up to the Civil War, this was common. This was basically just what happened in America. And we were okay with that. People, often have this, back and forth about what caused the Civil War, what was it over, And, of course, all you need to go, I mean, it's pretty easy. If you go read any document of secession, they will tell you what it's over. It's pretty clear, so I won't entertain that too much. But when you start, if you can get to how slavery is foundational to this country, if you can get to the idea that there would be no America without the right to deprive black people of their families, of their property, of their right to work, then you can understand your country in a much, much deeper way. Condoleezza Rice, and people are fond of repeating this, but she once said that slavery was America's birth defect. But slavery is not America's birth defect. Slavery is America's handmaiden. There can be no America without slavery. And if you can understand that, then you can understand how 600, 700, they keep up in the number, how whatever number of people died in the Civil War died. You got to understand, that must be like a powerful interest. Slaves, I hate to, put it this way, but slaves, if you, put slaves together and you tried to sell all of them off, they were worth $3 billion. $3 billion at that point was worth more than all of the nascent factories, all of the industry, basically all the productive capacity, as David Blight says, put together. Slaves were worth more than that. So when you look at the carnage of the Civil War and what came after, you can begin to understand why that might happen. And I wish the story ended there, but it doesn't. Because if you follow American history right out of Reconstruction, out of the Civil War into Reconstruction, you see, a period of brief promise. And then you see the right to take black people's stuff again. You see the right to take black people's land again. You see the right to deprive black people of the right to vote, which they had been given, which, obviously they didn't have under slavery, but deprive of the right of black folks to vote. And I just want to linger on that for a moment, because again, in our civil rights sort of dialogue, we say the vote, the vote, the vote, the vote, the vote. And it's really important to clarify this, okay? Voting is about money. Voting is very much about the allocation of tax funds. So if I take away your right to vote, if I take away your right to be represented, I have taken away your right to have any sort of representation over what is done with your tax dollars. So this is a continuation of taking black people's stuff. So if you are living in Mississippi, say in the 1920s, when black folks effectively cannot vote, this is not a symbolic thing. This means that I am taking your hard-earned membership to the society, I'm taking your hard-earned dollars, and I am building libraries out of which you cannot borrow books. I am building schools that you cannot attend. I am building whole universities that you cannot attend. I am building pools that you cannot swim in. I am paying a police force that, could care less about protecting you. I am taking, okay? Too often we think of this as a situation in which we think about our past as a period of time in which white people weren't very nice to black people. And we should stop that. We should all be nice to each other. But a better way to think about it is a period of time where Americans gave them the broad right to take things from black people. And if you follow this all through, the era of lynching, which is about the right to take your life, at will over any trumped up charge, even into our most, as all good, good-spirited liberals like to talk about, even at, our highest, points, at our most progressive legislation. You think about the New Deal. And you have a great professor, I guess not here, but at Columbia. It's all the same. I guess I'm going to credit Barnard with him, nonetheless. But Ira Katz Nelson, he wrote this beautiful book called Fear Itself. And it's a history of the New Deal through the perspective of race, or a significant portion of it is a history of the New Deal from the perspective of race. And what Katz Nelson makes clear is that there would be no New Deal without white supremacy. Southern support was central to the New Deal. And the only thing Southern Democrats cared about at that time was enforcing white supremacy. So you had senators, across the board. And if you look at Social Security, you look at any of the provisions, unemployment insurance, you look at even welfare, which would later become, it's ironic, would later become a tool for beating on black people and talking about how black people, just want to take. For the first 5 years, black people couldn't get welfare. They were cut out of it. Black people were cut out of Social Security, and the way this was accomplished was you basically look at where black people are in the South, and black people tended to work in housekeeping jobs as maids, or they tended to work out in the field, and they basically cut anybody who worked in those industries out of those benefits. When people tell you today, racism has gotten more sophisticated, it actually hasn't. That was pretty sophisticated what they did back then. It was the same sort of thing. I say to say that we have this as part of our legacy. We have the unfortunate fact of having just a tremendous wealth gap right now. I was reading a guy today, and he was saying, all the, trends for black folks are getting better. And I just wondered whether he had looked at the wealth gap. It's actually gotten worse over the past 20 years. I think the average white family has about 6 times as much wealth as the average black family. This is about our housing policy. This is about restricting black people from living certain places, about black people paying their dollars, again, into a system and getting less out of it, about the fact that black people are not, or were not at that point, eligible for FHA-insured loans. All this is part of the New Deal. And this wasn't just the South. I just came from doing all of this, reporting in Chicago, where black folks were just cut out. In my home city of Baltimore, here in New York, Stuyvesant Town, black people basically being cut out of society. Listen, I give you that long history lesson to understand that when you get into a courtroom and you get a jury, right, and you don't have witnesses to what happened, that says, well, maybe if you do have witnesses, sometimes witnesses just don't matter. If we have established within our culture, somewhere deep in our bones, that black people have less rights, that black people, that there's somewhere in the American psyche is the right to rob black people of things, none of this becomes surprising. Sean Bell doesn't become particularly surprising from that perspective. Patrick Dorsman does not become particularly surprising from that perspective. Jordan Davis doesn't become surprising at all, because there's a whole architecture of beliefs that's built up that reinforces the right to make these sorts of decisions. I think, I often get people who ask me, about solutions. They say, well, Ta-Nehisi, you say all this and you sound so pessimistic, and can you give us anything to make us feel good? And I can't. I really can't. And and in many ways, I guess I feel like that's sort of beyond my job. But if I were to point to something, I would say to begin to see your country clearly. If I could leave you with one thing, it would be that. See your country clearly. Because I feel like this is asking me, how do we cure Alzheimer's? I don't know, but the first thing is we got to know what Alzheimer's is. And we're in such a deep sleep right now. We're so far removed, and I don't know if that's because we've had this wonderful moment of an African American president, which is an achievement. It is a wonderful moment. I don't know if that blinds us. I don't know if it's the fact that some people will tell you that it's because segregation is less visible. But I don't. The problem with that is if you go back and start researching the history, we were always a little blind. Immediately after the Civil War, Southerners who had started the Civil War, the very same people who said the cause was slavery, immediately said, no, it wasn't about slavery. This is a kind of conscious blinding, such to the extent that you wonder if it's necessary to make the country possible in and of itself. I want to make sure I leave time for questions. That was a really long disquisition on the history of this country. And I do want to make sure I can take questions from the audience. Thank you. Hi, Farai.
Hi, Ta-Nehisi. Congratulations on being nominated again for a National Magazine Award. And
Thank you.
just generally blowing things up.
Thank you.
So let me ask you, I have a lot of questions, but I'm only going to ask one. I believe in that. Someone the other day asked how you basically get, the context was slightly different, but it was a forum with a lot of similar intent to this one. Asked how you transmit this kind of idea of clarifying your consciousness around race to young people, given that A, young people don't generally read the mainstream news media, B, a lot of the history books are totally outdated and totally products of what you're talking about. But what are the mechanisms, you being a father, of trying to reach kids broadly, you know?
Yeah, you know, I know. It's a tough question. It's hard. I try to cultivate some level of intellectual curiosity. I really try to cultivate a lot of skepticism. You know, a great deal of skepticism about what people tell you about the world, about life, and not like conspiratorial skepticism, but just a sort of, you know, oh, I know you read that, but is that true? It's funny, I'm working on this book right now, and as I was walking up here, I was just talking to my editor, and I was telling him that one of the, if there's any, you know, well, there are many cool things about being black, but one of the cool things about being black is, you know, black people have an insight into their country that I think other people can't really have. And it's not, you know, it has nothing to do with the color of the skin or, you know, what's in your blood or anything like that, but to live in an Enlightenment republic, to live in, you know, the oldest democracy in the world, but to live in the basement, to live under, you know, it just gives you a special kind of skepticism and a special kind of perspective on the country and on humanity at large. I try really hard to work with that and cultivate that in my son. What I don't do is force books down his throat. I don't do that. Because I don't want his memory of reading and the acquisition of knowledge to be like, my dad told me to do it. You know, I hope it's, you know, more like I feel this way and I'm compelled to, you know about X, Y, and Z. Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things I've followed that, and one of the debates that's going on as well, you know, maybe this is just reflective that 4-year-old kids do more to get expelled who are black. What you could do at 4 to be expelled is amazing. I have no idea what that would be, but be that as it may, one thing I do think it might be a reflection of is I was fairly lucky and singular in the sense that I had parents that constantly, you know, advocated for me. Everybody I lived around didn't have that. It wasn't because their parents didn't care about them. You know, it's just, you know, you got bills to pay, things to keep up with. You know, you're trying to, you know, keep your kids safe. I don't think people realize how much of the school system is about, like, parental demands and parental interaction. I'll give you a great example of this. I have some friends who shall, you know, most certainly remain nameless, who are not black, and their kid was caught with drugs at school, in middle school. If I were in Baltimore and I got caught with drugs, that could be the end of my scholastic career effectively. They would put me in some other, you know, school somewhere, and, you know, they had a no tolerance policy when I was coming up. This kid's parents, you know, went up there and argued, you know, as they should. You know, said, you will not do this to our kid. You just absolutely will not. Guess what? They did not. You know, not only do we not tend to have, like, you know, not tend to have the sort of resources to do that, you know, just the energy to, you know, but we don't even, like, necessarily have, like, the confidence about our place in society to do that. That requires a certain standing, if you think about it, like a certain way of thinking about yourself and how you exist within the country. And I don't know that we have that. You know, I mean, one of the stories I always tell is when I was in 2nd grade, a teacher tried to, you know, as happens to so many young black boys, tried to put me in special ed. And who stood between that? My mom. I mean, that was all I had. was all I had, you know. And had I had different parents, I could easily imagine a totally different reality.
As a first-generation Nigerian American, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on new immigrant groups that are coming into this country, particularly since changes in law, immigration law toward the end of the 70s. And as these groups come of age and are entering this history and landscape of the US, how things in your mind, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of the history I just laid out in the basic fault line, I actually don't expect it to change very much, regrettably. There is some feeling that, you know, because America is becoming less white, as people say it, well, there's an argument America becomes less white and thus, you know, the politics of America change. That's the idea that whiteness actually is a specific thing. Like that it exists in a specific unchangeable place. People come here who are not white, and you know that changeable place shrinks, and thus the politics shrinks. But you know, you study the history of this country. Whiteness is not a fixed thing. Race is the product of racism, not the other way around. You know, and racism has no problem changing what race is. You know, it's never had a problem changing what race is. You know, what is black in America is not what's black in Brazil, is not what's black in South Africa. This is an invention, and the invention has no problem changing with power. And the idea that, you know, people who were enslaved here, or people who bear some relation to people who were enslaved here, are subjects for plunder, for American plunder, I don't see much about America that's changing. And, you know, to take that from the other end, you know, you would think this would be encouraging because, you know, you hear about, you know, immigrants coming in from Africa, from the Caribbean, doing really, really well. You know, going to Ivy League schools, you know, succeeding in ways that African Americans have not. But if you follow like the longitudinal studies, they have like people through generations now, like 2, 3 generations. And the saddest thing in the world you see is that these people just become black within the 2nd or 3rd generation. They follow the basic rules of America. We have a foundational thing that is repeated. And I don't think it's, you know, can really be changed by demography. You know, it's not like when the Irish got here, people were saying, "Welcome to, you know, white America, come in." You know, that wasn't really the greeting they got. You know, you can look at, you know, for instance, the old like cartoons, political cartoons of what people thought of Irish people, and you can see, you know, some of the most racist stuff you ever want to see. But when it came down to it, you know, the tent of whiteness, or should I say unblackness, you know, was big enough to let them in. I just don't know if that foundational thing changes because of immigration.
Thank you. The second part of my question really quickly is, I went to high school in Seattle, Washington. I feel like the racial dynamics there are slightly different. I was born in the mid-'80s. I feel like also there's this thing going on where, of course, there's this racial binary dynamic that comes along with this. So there would be African, black kids, and also Asian kids and white kids. And although I feel like many of us didn't like learn to play these roles until much later, people had choices. So the Asian kids or whoever else who wanted to listen to hip hop, like culturally people made choices about how they wanted to align themselves. And I feel like that's part of it. Like these discussions that we have now about blackness and whiteness, they're often very much shunted as exactly these, like black and white, without an in-between.
Yeah, you know what though, I think like the problem there is there's a confusion between 2 different things, okay? I just want to go back to this idea, racism creates race, and like that's really, really important because the historical thing between black people in this country is not the same, it's not a diversity project. In other words, I think like especially on the left, we get into this, you know, like coalition idea of, you know, where you got black people, you got brown people, you got, you know, Asian American people, and you know, over here you have white people. And we just got to figure out how to mix this up and let everybody be people. What I'm trying to say is the African American relationship to this country is a specific particular thing that's very, very different. that shouldn't obscure our other conversations. It's a different conversation. It's not the same conversation as, say, the very important conversation about what people are doing, say, to Latinos in Arizona. That's an important conversation that should be had on its own terms. But it's not the same conversation. I think we really, really need to be clear about that. We are not, all just one big melange with some white dude's boot on our neck. We're different. We have different historical experiences. So I know that, when people say, well, this black-white binary thing, it doesn't make room for me. But that's because that's another conversation. I mean, and I don't say that to shunt anybody's, experience, much like, obviously, I'm very much in sympathy, with, folks that are being victimized in Arizona. But it's not, I wouldn't go to Arizona and say, well, where am I in this conversation? It's a different conversation. It's a different, and it's an important conversation. It's one I support. It's one I've written about. One I'll continue to write about. But the relationship between African Americans, the whole point, or part of the point of me going through that entire history, is to say we aren't just another. It's not just, oh, here's a group that white people dislike. It's something deeper and something particular about that relationship. And I'm sure if it was somebody standing up here who had spent their time, studying Latino identity, they could give, a very, very unique disquisition on the history of Latinos in this country and what that's meant. If somebody was studying, Native American identity, they could, do the exact same thing that I just did, and they could, delineate how it's different. I understand on the left there's this idea of coalitions and everybody, and that's fine, and especially fine for activists. But as a writer, it's really my job to delineate the differences and be very clear about what they are.
I guess you said that you ended on a pessimistic note, or that your writing kind of exposes the underlying history and racism in the country. And I guess for people who get it, who see it, it's really frustrating to wake up every day and kind of have to, face comments like that, right? So what are some things that make you happy, that this is your work, right? This is what
it makes me very happy to hear your question. It makes me very happy to be here right now. I'm not being condescending. I really, really mean that. Listen, I think there are two things, okay? I can talk to you about the society, but I just want to talk to you as a young, inquiring person, and as somebody who, at one point was equally frustrated because people said things like this to me, and it was just maddening. We're all going to die someday. It ends badly, right? We know that. We know that. And it probably ends like the country will probably ultimately destroy itself. I mean, as most states tend to. It ends badly, right? I'm getting to the optimistic part. But listen, though. Listen. But you're not the country, and you're not the state. And within that, you must decide, where you want to be when history's counted up. Do you want to be, a part of the people that tried to push the country over the edge? Or do you want to be, a part of the people who, even if it didn't work, who tried to stop that? I think there's great nobility, and I think there's great peace. I think there's great happiness in deciding how you personally want to live your life. People often say, well, if it's going to go bad, then why don't I just, go do, why should I care? You should care because you care. You should care because that's part of being a good person. What happens in this country is not an answer for how you should live your life. I get pleasure out of this. I mean that. It fulfills me, to go out and speak to audiences about this country's history. I hope I've, brought a little bit of, light, into some people. And I hope that, it feels better to know. It's like the Matrix. What's the pill you take to go back in? Is it the red? The red is the one you take to go back in, right? So it's like, now you're out the Matrix, It's good to be out of the Matrix, It's good to know. And I think, the other thing is African Americans, even if they don't articulate it this way, but in their culture, walk around with this kind of fatalism all day. They know. They know. And you can see it, if you listen to the music, if you spend any time around them, the sort of heroic, optimistic idea that, America saves itself and eventually saves the world it doesn't have much currency among African Americans, although we can be, optimistic also. I don't want to, but I'm saying in our private spaces, we know, and I just think it's good to know, I hope that helps. I hope that helps. It does make me happy too. I love writing. I love writing about this stuff. I'm not, it depresses me a little bit, but, it's good. Oh, one other thing. You know what? I'll tell you a story. I had a piece coming out in June, okay? Kind of dealing with a lot of what I was talking about. I went to the west side of Chicago for this piece to report this out. And I interviewed a man who is 92 years old. He was born in the 1920s in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Over the course of his life, he worked really, really hard, worked for Campbell's Soup Company in Chicago, was a sharecropper in Mississippi, was born to a family that had property. The property was taken from them by the state, ostensibly, about taxes, but if you know anything about Mississippi, they just took the land. When he was 12 years old, he had a horse that was taken from him and put on a racetrack just because they could, The cotton, when they went to weigh it up, they were supposed to do a 50-50 split, but if it was 50 cents a pound, they would get him like 5 cents a pound. And he basically just robbed of everything, went to Chicago and got robbed again. It is not right that that should happen, and no one should give testimony to that. It's totally, totally unfair that he should have to die with that, and that people should, not know about that. It gives me great pleasure to know that people will at least know that that won't be forgotten. And that happened to black people all around the country. It needs to be known. It needs to be told. That, gives me some sort of sense of fairness in the world and justice.
So you talked about promoting ideas and having public discourse and why it's absolutely necessary everywhere, but especially on a college campus. And kind of as a black woman, as a person of color at this university, you can understand that I'm a minority here. And we kind of play a role of transmitting different ideas and transmitting information that people normally wouldn't be able to receive. So you probably don't follow much of like college politics, but recently a student group made a banner to post on Barnard's campus. It was about justice in Palestine. It was removed by the campus because some students felt this was too confrontational and felt unsafe by this banner. And you talked a lot about things being stolen from people and people of color. And though I often have to transmit ideas, and I often have to explain to people why colonization is a bad thing, or why it's not okay to have slaves if you take care of them, it gets kind of redundant. But at the same time, I didn't realize how much I loved my voice until it was taken away from me on campus. And a lot of people of color on this campus honestly, we just feel betrayed. Like, we don't have a right to express any kind of politics if it's contrary to what the popular party on campus believes. And Barnard has expressed that they will remove it. I'm sorry, I just feel very I can't believe my voice was taken away from me. And what do you have to say to the many people on campus and many campuses around the United States of America who are also going to do the same thing?
Yeah, I don't know what happened here at Barnard. So I guess I should start there. But I don't think anybody can take your voice away from you. It's a long tradition. Like I said, I went to Howard University in DC. And I'm not urging anybody to do this. But there was a long tradition of protest. There was a long tradition of taking over the administration building. That was part of what we were. And I believe there's a long protest tradition up here, too. I don't think you guys are, so I'm a little stunned to hear that, they took down the banner and that was the end of it. I mean, maybe it should be the end of it. I don't know, because I haven't seen the banner, right? I want to be real clear about that. I haven't seen the banner, so maybe that should be the end of it. But putting that aside, a protest is not what other people allow you to do. A protest is kind of the opposite. So assuming your cause is true and your cause is just and your cause is humane, you got to do what you got to do. I'm sure I just got in trouble.
During my undergrad studies, had the great opportunity to read this book entitled White Privilege, which really was an expose, not so much just on the statement of being white versus black, but really a statement of this notion that people don't feel comfortable speaking about race and speaking about being white in and of itself as being a privilege and what it meant to be white. I think so often we speak about race in the context of what's going on in the group that we're talking about. Right. And we try to convey what it means to be of this race from the context of what you're being deprived of.
Right.
And my question is really how we could incorporate this discussion of what a group member who is white, the privileges that they have access to, how that could be incorporated into the conversation so that we could really fully, as a nation, begin to understand what resources need to be provided in order to make sure that we're not depriving anyone who's not white of resources and opportunities.
Okay, so one of the things I try to do is I always try to be as specific as I possibly can. I'm sure the book was fine, and I'm sure it's a great book, and I'm sure it's a deeply enlightening book. But like, I really try to avoid the phrase white privilege, and I try much harder to talk about like specific privileges. And again, I try to make that as concrete as I can. So, for instance, and I sort of alluded to this at the end of my conversation, right? Anytime anyone wants to have a conversation with me about, what's going on, say, in Harlem, or what's going on in any inner city in America, I immediately remind them that there was a relatively recent period in history where one group in this country was allowed to get access to financing for homes, financing for businesses, the ability to live wherever they wanted, and another group was wholly cut out of that. And you got to understand like how huge that is. One of the things I was talking about amnesia, right? And one of the things like that people do is, racism is a double trap because people make the sin and then they compound it by covering it up and acting like it didn't happen, right? So we have, and part of this is our sort of cult of individuality. So you talk to anybody in a house out in the suburbs. This is my house. I bought this house. I saved up. I did X, Y, and Z. Nowhere in there is like the tax money to build the highways, to go to that house. Nowhere in there is the insurance that was made upon the loans that were, originally given when people first moved out to those houses. Nowhere in there is just the whole architecture of social policy that black people were cut out of in the middle of this century. That's huge. Actually, that's just, and that's like one thing, right? Like that's one specific thing. And I talk to people, here's another one. I always tell people, African-American males, particularly in this country or in the world, comprise some ridiculous, minuscule minority, 0.00 something percent. African-American males are 8% of the people who are incarcerated in the entire world. That is unconscionable and ridiculous. I try to talk about really, really specific things. It's not just the fact, oh, you're white and people give you things, like that old Eddie Murphy skit, white people give each other things. It's not as simple, And I think with some, perhaps justification, when people hear that phrase, they just sort of, blunt, what are you talking about? I try to make it as specific as I possibly can. You take stop and frisk up here, right? And, Mayor Bloomberg, if, you believe his, if you just take him at face value, you just take his argument, right? I don't, but let's just take it, which is, well, I can do this. I can harass this number of people because I'm making, crime drop, right? And anything that, I do, do that is okay. Well, why don't we just put everybody in jail too? I'm sure that would make crime drop. If you just put, let's do that. That would definitely make crime drop. And I say that not to mock him, but you have to think about that. What that says is me, strictly because I'm black, just because I'm black, I should be subject to police harassment even though I haven't done anything. I should be. Period. I mean, that's the logical inference of what he's saying. It's the total obliteration of my individuality as a person. It says the most important thing between me and the interaction with the cops is the fact that I'm black, and whether I've done anything or not, I should be subject to search and seizure in a way that white people should not be. It's very important to talk like in that really, really specific way. That's the policy. That's the policy. And I think like that, if there's any help, in terms of clarifying, I'm skeptical that people who, that everybody wants to be helped. I think some people don't want to be helped, and they just act like they do. But for those that want to, I try to be as specific as I possibly can.
I just wanted to thank you because I think you spoke a little bit about intellectual curiosity, and I feel like among the people I read, you're one who really contributes to mine. So I just wanted to thank you. But I do have a question about where I've never heard you speak until today, but I read a lot of your writing. How you find, I guess, how you cultivate your writing ability and what you do to make your writing so clear, because I feel as though many conversations I have with people from home or people around who are, saying like, why don't we just talk about it in terms of poor people have, and you have that great piece where the word yacht is in the title, and it's really clear about how, poor black children are more likely to live in communities of poverty, whereas poor white children are more likely to live in a community where their school is at least a little bit better than their home situation, and yada, yada, yada. But how do you cultivate your writing as to like get to these points so clearly, and like what's your process?
Well, I practice writing, and I've practiced it for a long time. Maybe as long as you've been alive. I mean, that's true. I'm getting old. I practice it, and I do it as much as I possibly can. And I try to subject myself to the best arguments I can find from people who disagree with me. And then I try to answer them. I think one of the worst things you can do as a writer is there's a whole debate style of writing where you find the person at their weakest point, or you straw man the argument, and then you answer it. But it's like I approach this like in boxing. You want to fight the best in the world. I want your best argument. I'm gonna knock it out. That's always my approach. I try to go for the person at their strongest point. Because if I can't do that, then I'm wrong. And it's one or the other. I think that has an effect upon people. It just makes it very, very clear and very, very convincing. And I just try to subject myself to as much rigor as I possibly can. My own arguments. What am I saying? Is this really what I think? Is this actually correct? I try to be really, really hard on myself, much harder than anybody who I'm debating with will be. And I hope that by the time I get to a debate, any counter argument that the person is going to have, I've already went through it in my mind.
Good afternoon. My name is Sydney Mosley. I'm an alum of this lovely institution and also from Baltimore.
Oh, really? Where?
I grew up in West Baltimore, Woodbrook Avenue.
Where?
Woodbrook Avenue across from
Woodbrook
Park. Yeah.
I was born on Woodbrook Avenue.
No.
Are you serious? Near Druid Hill? Near Druid Hill?
Yes.
Wow.
Okay, so we family. All right.
I actually was born up on Park Heights. Woodbrook is the first one I remember, though.
Yeah.
Jesus. Wow.
Okay, so.
I lived there when I was 5 years old.
Huh?
I lived there when I was. Woodbrook's rough.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm from the hood.
Jesus, obviously.
Yes.
I used to live on Woodbrook. Good God. Whoa.
So.
You come a long way.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, you really
right.
have.
So
Yeah.
the reason why, so I have a lot of thoughts.
I don't. Hold on.
obviously.
I want to say,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be condescending to you,
Yeah.
but whenever I've never, maybe on 2 occasions when I meet people from Baltimore, are they from West Baltimore, or that part of Baltimore? It's always East Baltimore, outside of Baltimore. So when I say you come on, I'm not being condescending. I'm saying that because I know.
No, and
Yeah.
I absolutely understand that. And the reason why I'm not still on Woodbrook Avenue is because I also had parents who advocated for
Right.
me.
Right.
And they, paid more money than they had for me to go to a really good school so I could end up here so that I could do the things that I'm doing now.
Right.
And so one of the most poignant things that you said in your talk was about this idea of robbing Black boys and Black men of the right to change and of the right to grow and become people, out and in the world. And, I am almost 30, and so the men who are my peers are, they're all turning 30 now, and they're celebrating because nobody ever thought that they would make it to that age, right? So that really has stayed with me, just in hearing you say that over the past hour or so. And but what the other layer I want to bring to that is I want to layer the gender thing over race, because a lot of my work is in gender-based street harassment. And there was an incident that happened, a girlfriend of mine told me this summer, where she was walking the streets in Brooklyn right after the Zimmerman verdict came out. And so, like you were saying, there's this understanding that we have in African-American culture. Like, we get it. We understand. We come from this place. We understand the institutional racism. So, as a Black woman, she was very, heavy on her heart about this whole situation. She's walking on the street, and then Black men are catcalling her, saying all kinds of things out of pocket to her. And that story just really made me angry for obvious reasons. But what I guess my question is to you is, I just wonder what your thoughts are, just thinking about, the support that Black women often, understand and bring to this struggle and this understanding of robbing Black men and Black boys of their lives, but then seemingly many Black men not also giving that support back to them in the same kind of way.
Well, yeah. Well, there's think like there's a belief, an unfortunate belief among a lot of people that oppression is ennobling, that like getting punched in the face will somehow make you sensitive to other people who get punched in the face. Sometimes it does, but very often it makes you just go punch other people in the face. You know, inside every bully is somebody who was bullied, very often, very often. And they're still dudes, you know, they're still men. They're still men. And I think like, so I want to deal with that, you know, on one perspective. There's, you know, no thing about being black and being male that necessarily guarantees you that you're going to be any more enlightened about women. Now, there have been points in history where, for very strategic reasons, you know, black men have made particular decisions. You know, for instance, sorting, you know, Douglas, for instance, supporting suffrage in the 1850s, right? But that's a particularly enlightened person. You know what I mean? At a particular moment. Black men are subject to the same, you know, forces and the same biases as anybody else, as any other man. And I think, like, if I were to broaden this out in any sort of way, right? And this is just like, you know, things that you note under further areas of research, right? When you talk about plunder, you talk about the right to take things from people, right? You talk about, like, people not having property over their body, people not having property over their destiny. I mean, that obviously leads you right to a feminist critique. Because what did spousal rape become illegal, what, in the 70s, 60s, or 70s, or something like that? It's a recent development. It's a within our, you know, lifetime development. That's about property of your body. You know, I'm just going to go out here right now. I don't think I'm going out here, you know, with anybody in this room. But I mean, when we talk about abortion rights, right? I mean, this is about the right to your body at the end of the day. You know, the idea that you should give up your body for this particular thing in a way that a man will never have to give up his body. I think it was Kim Novak at the Academy Awards. She came out and she had all this plastic surgery, and she just, I mean, people were just absolutely horrible to her. But part of that is like, you don't even have a right to age. You know, nobody's gonna be like that to Jack Nicholson. You know, Jack Nicholson looks horrible. No one cares. You know, no one cares. You know, you don't even have a right for your body to go through the natural process that human bodies go through. You know, so, you know, I just, you know, regrettably, you know, we went through this a little bit, like, a few years back, particularly in 2008, when, you know, during the marriage rights movement, you know, and same-sex marriage, and there was some feeling, well, why aren't African Americans more sensitive about, why should African Americans be more sensitive? Were the Irish any more sensitive to black people because, you know, they had a foot on their neck? Were the Italians any more sensitive? Having a foot on your neck rarely makes you more sensitive. That's the hard, you know, factor, you know, about things. And I know, you know, we're in this world, we have to build coalitions, you know, be activists. But the way to do that is to understand the challenge and not delude yourself, you know, about the hard work that's really, you know, in front of you. Regrettably, there's no reason to expect, you know, cats in Bed-Stuy to be any more enlightened than cats in Bensonhurst. They're men.
When you responded, they're still men, it was a little too simplistic for me as working in gender politics and understanding the nature, because it's about intersectionality between race and gender and all types of other issues that people are facing. And to say so simply that they're still men kind of takes away from what you can do about that situation, because it's not, quote unquote, natural for men to oppress women. It's a societal issue, it's a patriarchal issue, and that needs to be dissected and further explored, and within the intersectionality of race and gender. And so, to me, by putting "they're still men" on that, it really too much simplifies the issue of street harassment, the issue that particularly black women are facing in our society right now. Often the invisibility of black women in the black struggle, which has lasted before the civil rights movement, since the civil rights movement, now today, we're constantly not seeing black women in this struggle, and recognizing it. Even when President Obama talked about bringing, you know, black boys on a platform and creating this new platform for Black boys in his administration, he's talking about a very patriarchal way of approaching that in Black families, and so it's still it's perpetuating this idea that because they're still men, we can't do something about it, but we can, and it sort of makes it even it brings women into this very powerless state by just saying they're still men. So I appreciate your answer, but I also would appreciate a further dissection into this intersection of race and gender.
Right. So when I say they're still men, much the way I would say they're still white or they're still Black, I'm not speaking to a biological reality. So in saying they're still men, I do not mean, I don't know what, they still have penises. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that that Black men exist within the identity of what men are in this country and in this world. And being Black does not really pull you out of that. That doesn't make you any, much as I would say, you may have in your family, not in your, well, maybe in your family actually, but you may have, in your stock, say Irish. You say, well, I was Irish and I had X, Y, and Z happen to me. In America, you're white, and you're still white. Like that doesn't go away. And so I guess my beef with this, and this is like my ongoing sort of debate, with those of us who believe in the possibility of coalitions, on the left, is I don't know that we're ever any more sympathetic to each other. I don't want to be totally pessimistic about that, but when you tell me like brothers on the corner are doing X, Y, and Z, right? It's not that I think it's natural, right? It's not that I think it's the way it has to be. I just wonder about the expectation that they would do anything else because they're Black. In other words, because they're oppressed, that they might see certain things, or they might be open to certain things that other folks who have not seen what they've seen would be. I just don't know that that's the route. I don't know that that's the way in. I think we have a shocking, just as people, just a shocking ability to disregard empathy and not be empathetic and find reasons for why certain people deserve things, but we don't. So I was plundered of my body. That was wrong, but you kind of deserved it because of, any number of invented reasons, that I can come up with. Does that help? I really want to make sure I'm getting to your question. Okay, you sure? Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you.